stone. Not until the day fate's judgment arrives. This is my redemption.
Promeia's come around, and not only is she a strong character, she's also got surprisingly strong mindscapes. At first, the statement isn't one that resonates with many people. Considering how expensive getting a character can be, pulling for dupes tends to be seen as something for whales, but as it turns out, that's not really the case. If the optics of going for a mindscape is that of going beyond a character's baseline, pulling a Wenjin is often framed as getting to that baseline. Lucia and Nangong were just recently released, and both of their kits work in such a way that makes it seem as if the game expects you to have their signatures. Without the energy regen from her Wenjin, Lucia isn't able to max out her electric death ignore. Either you need to use another character signature, namely Orphe's, or you're stuck with an A-rank alternative, which has a lower main stat value. Nangong works as a Sunna sub-DPS of sorts, but that's only true if you happen to have Neon Fantasies. Her core passive gives her impact with Anomaly Mastery, and her Wenjin is the only Sunna option that has that. Thing is, Wenjins aren't cheap. They are cheaper than Mindscapes on average, but you're still committing no shortage of pulls to it. If that's the case, a question then arises. Should I pull the Wenjin or the Mindscape? As a guide maker, this is a question I get very, very often. Even if you see getting a character to M2P1 or above as the realm of whales, dedicated savers, or lucksackers, M0P1 and M1P0 are both relatively relatable levels of investment for players. With the aggressive increases in HP we've seen to older bosses as of late, how long a character is relevant for in the meta can ride on this question. In many cases, the answer is pretty obvious. Astra's Elegant Vanity is arguably one of the smallest damage increases to team score that a signature has provided so far. Kaboom the Cannon is plenty good as is, and in fact, against Ether weak enemies, Unfettered Game Ball is likely to outperform Astra's signature. Considering the 15% team-wide damage increases that her M1 provides, on top of more condensed openness owing to its starting Daspo bonus, going for her Wenjin over M1 is one of the worst investment decisions a player can make. Her partner Evelyn, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. The difference in scores you'd get between her signature and A-rank alternatives tends to land at around 25%. While her M1's Decibel bonus can be useful, as far as damage goes, it's only 12% in Death Shred, which would amount to roughly a 7% increase against standard defense enemies. Not to mention the value the Wenjin has outside of Evelyn herself. Heartstring Nocturne is a great generalist option for attackers, which can be used in other agents in place of their own signatures as a decent runner-up alternative. The problem is that not every character is that clear-cut. While it's easy to point to calcs that define the damage numbers, the reality tends to be a lot more muddled. Sometimes a character's mindscapes are absurdly busted, with numbers that one would think makes them better than their signature, but secondary factors like build-up rates and increases to enemy anomaly thresholds throw a spanner in the works. Sometimes a Wenjin seems ideal, providing the exact stats a character needs to complete their kit and be at their best, but then in practice, a combination of stat saturation and round start effects makes it fall far behind the Mindscape. And sometimes, both Wenjins and Mindscapes are strong, but which is better is entirely dependent on the team comp and the encounter. So let's talk a bit about how you can spot whether or not a dupe really is going for over a Wenjin, and touch on both promeia and wind anomalies as we do so, because, as it turns out, figuring out the answer is a lot more complicated than what you might expect. Naturally, to even begin contemplating whether Mindscapes or Wenjin is better, you need the means to get it, and Surfshark VPN may just be able to help you with that. £100 may look like $100, but when you factor in currency differences, it's almost 35% more expensive to top up in the UK than in the US. Regional price discrimination is a real thing, and it's incredibly common. Either you pay an unfair price, or you Surfshark VPN to get around it, which has well over 4,500 servers in over 100 different locations. The benefits don't end there either. Being from the UK, there are a lot of websites that I'm not allowed to access. I might be browsing Reddit, decide to check out a post, and lo and behold, it links out to IMGA, which has outright barred my country from accessing it in full. This isn't a problem with Surfshark VPN though, as I can turn it on to bypass regional blocking to access it and a whole load of other websites that would otherwise be impossible for me to use. They have a plethora of other services too. You can protect your identity with alternate ID to stay anonymous when signing up for accounts, or make use of their antivirus suite and monitoring tools to help you stay safe. You can get started for barely over £1 a month, and if you're on the fence about it, then rest assured, as they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you are interested in giving Surfshark VPN a go, check it out with the QR code on screen or the link in the description. Using the lin code at checkout will give you an extra 4 months of it for free. Thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this part of the video. Innocent Idealism is Premier's M1, and it's especially good. For some agents, like Astra, evaluating whether or not something is actually good comes down to numbers. 18% rest rate active at all times is a kind of bonus that's very easy to calculate. Promeia, though, gets 1 extra trial by code point when she uses her ultimate with M1. By itself, this isn't a damage add, but the way in which it is used can make a very big difference to her scores. Let's take Notorious Butcher with the Nangong team as an example. Most promeia combos end up getting 4 blooms, but that's primarily because she's lacking in resources. It's perfectly possible for her to fit in 5 blooms in a stun window. If you were to exploit freeze, she could do 6 or even 7, but she does not get enough corrosive chill generation in the fight to sustain that on every stun. She can, however, use her ultimate on every stun. I looked at one of my runs, and between Shatters, the Sworders, and the Blooms, the team was doing around 39 million in a stun, with Premier's Blooms hitting for a little over 4.1 million each. If we're strict and normalize that to 40 million per stun and 4 million per Bloom, this Mindscape alone is providing a 10% increase in combo damage. Naturally, damage still happens out of stun, so that isn't a 10% increase of scores, but it's close. And all of this assumes I'd be hitting 40 million damage on every stun, and that most certainly wasn't the case. On Notorious Butcher, it's possible to push for 5 total, and this base is so aggressive that by the 3rd I could only spare around 3 Blooms in a combo, sometimes less. Rather than getting 20 Blooms over the course of 5 stuns, 16 was the absolute limit. Using a simple score calculator, if I were to add 20 million in damage to my final score, roughly the amount of damage I'd get from 5 additional Blooms, it'd have taken my 56,600 run to almost 61,000. When excluding performance points, that's well over an 8% increase in damage score without any stat bonuses. Admittedly, it was hard to hit 5 ultimates consistently, but then you remember that Promeia gets decibels in her own Blooms, so not only does this get her to score higher, it makes it easier to do so too. Going from 16 to 21 Blooms is a big increase, but if you happen to run Promeia with Vivian, it's nowhere near as good. I counted 31 Blooms in my 53,000 score run, but between unused trial by code points, corrosive chill overcapping, and mismanagement of Vivian's feathers, 35 plus was very much doable. So I'm getting less than half of the value on a Vivian team than I was on an Angong one. Far less, because it's not as if those extra Blooms would be going in stun. Promeia had more than enough resources for that, it'd be landing outside of it. And when so much more of the team's damage comes from the Zorders and Vivian's own Blooms, such an increase of Promeia matters a lot less. The gains from such additional effects on Mindscapes varies wildly depending on the team. And putting these gains in the context of numbers is helpful, but there's advantages that Mindscapes can provide beyond simple damage increases. Fufu is a character who I'd say has an M1 that's significantly better than her Wenjin. Part of that is numbers. Roaring Furnace providing damage bonus while her Mindscape increases the stun damage multiplier is a big factor, owing to the nature of stat saturation. And the attack main stat seems helpful to her builds, but then you realize that it's only shifting things around. If she's using her signature, you get 18% impact on a d6. If she's using something like Hellfire Gears, you get 30% attack on a d6. It's all the same. If anything, the greatest benefit to Roaring Furnace is the daze % increase that it provides, as the flat impact from Jufufu's core passive is applied in combat. Impact % gains that you get from stun or Wenjin effects don't scale with it, but daze % does. Yet her M1 gives more daze than her Wenjin, despite it not having any stat bonuses related to it. What gives? Turns out that for Jufufu to get that combat impact to begin with, she needs to be in the Tiger's Raw state. Even by making use of parries on her to get momentum stacks, it can take anywhere from 20 to 25 seconds to build the might needed to enter it. Her M1 though has her start the fight with it. This not only gives her the buff far earlier, it also leads to an extra aftershock chain attack. The more accelerated path to first turn cascades onto the rest of the fight. On Wandering Hunter, it makes it much easier to push 5 stun Ishuan routes, and Miasma Priest's 4 stuns become way more comfortable, with specific parry moves no longer being needed. Of course, most good Mindscapes also have a stat component to them. Premier's M1 is no different, but its effect is a little harder to grasp at a glance than a blanket increase. On top of trial by code point on ultimate use, it also increases her death ignore effect on the Blooms from 40 to 60%. With the way death works, the more you shred, the better it gets. Going from 0 to 20% is an increase of roughly 12% in damage, but going from 40 to 60% is an increase of over 16% instead. Some napkin math can help paint the picture of how good this is. If we take our theoretical 21 Bloom run, then boost their 4 million damage by the 16% increase they get, and that take our scores from 56,600 to around 63,800. Considering that in my actual run I was short of an Bloom at the end, had I landed at all, this M1 would have been the difference between scoring in the mid 50,000s to an outright kill. Let's not forget that this death ignore effect would also apply to Nangong's Blooms. Altogether, this Mindscape would be landing at around a 15% score increase. Although we've established Vivian doesn't benefit much from extra trial by code points, she does benefit from the increase of her Blooms. When you look at how much damage she's contributing, Premier's M1 can yield as great an increase of Vivian team as an Nangong one. This is great and all, but that's assuming Promeia has Frostfall Sickle. That's what I was using in my runs after all. If the question we're meant to answer is whether a Wenjin or a Mindscape is better, we need to look at what is being lost from not running a signature, because that too has caveats. Frostfall Sickle is pretty good, and not having it can mean that Premier's M1 gets worse. It provides a steep ice damage gain and, more importantly, a bloom damage, which sits in a different multiplier bucket, helping it avoid saturation. Not only as part of its effect, but through its main stat too, Anomaly Mastery. Considering that Premier's core passive scales with the stat, giving her both Anomaly Proficiency and a team-wide bloom damage bonus, it's a big deal. A trial by code point on ultimate use translates to more damage through Blooms. The increase of Premier's death ignore applies only to a blooms. Losing out on Frostful Sickle means that the proportionate gain brought about by M1 is diminished. There are no A rank or standard S rank Wenjin alternatives that provide anomaly mastery, much less a bloom damage. This has an effect on routes too. 5 automates and 5 stuns is the target here, but less anomaly mastery on Butcher makes freeze management a lot more difficult and some combos outright fail. Even if we were to ignore all this and consider M1 was still giving a 15% increase, which would be boosting my scores by around 8,000, using Electro Lip Gloss or Weeping Gemini on a Nangong team was lowering my scores by more than 8,000. Even a 15% increase to those scores wouldn't match Frostful Sickle. The answer is simple then. For Promeia at least, her Wenjin is better than her Mindscape. Except that you've got to remember that standard S ranks can be overclocked. A P5 Electro Lip Gloss might be similar in performance to a P1 Fusion Compiler, with P2, P3, P5? Now things change a little. Where I might have been averaging 55,000 in score with Frostful Sickle, a P5 compiler wasn't even 2,000 score behind. Granted, compiler is even worse for Premier's M1 than the A ranks. Its pen ratio main stat lessens the value of Death Ignore and vice versa. The 16% increase for bloom damage she was getting goes down to only 13%. This is partially made up by the stats in a P5 compiler. It's a lot of attack percent and anomaly proficiency, heightening the baseline that a bloom scale from. Still, and the bloom that hits for 828,000 on Frostful Sickle is doing only 759,000 on a P5 compiler with max stacks. Then you compare the shadow damage and it's way ahead, enough to kill MK2 where Premier's signature couldn't. In practice this wouldn't be too common, as Promeia would need to build up and maintain stacks. She does get them easily with her EX special string, but it's not as if she's got 40 energy to spend every 8 seconds. It's not so bad on Nangong, where the burst is relatively condensed, but Compiler's lack of resources and anomaly mastery for bloom damage scaling meant it suffered a lot more with Vivian. Despite it not having full uptime, there is still merit to it. Maybe Premier's M1 isn't giving the full 15% damage increase it would with her signature, but as little as a 4 to 5% gain would be enough for it to win out. For my runs at the very least, that was most certainly the case. On Butcher with Nangong specifically, having M1 for the added anomaly buildup from an extra B5 and a Bloom EX every stun, as well as the easier Decibel management more than made up for any routing issues from Compiler's lack of anomaly mastery. So case closed, M1 is better than Signature for Promeia, if you're to ignore the context surrounding it. Standard S-Rings can evidently be quite strong, but the reality for most is that just because a P5 Compiler or P5 Brimstone or P5 Weeping Cradle can have relatively small differences when compared to some agents' signature engines, having even one dupe of the relevant pick is rare. I'm a whale, Leviathan even, with multiple M6P5 characters, and I've just recently managed to hit 3 copies of Fusion Compiler. That's more than 4,000 total pulls on Wenjin banners, and I still don't have it at P5. Of course, you can spend residual signal to get them, 30 pulls worth for a copy. To do so feels like a waste though. Those are pulls that could be going to either a signature or even a Mindscape. Even at a large sample size, when it takes less than 50 pulls on average for a Wenjin drop, spending triple that to max out a standard S rank that's still going to be worse than a signature isn't particularly inspiring. Thinking in these terms makes it clear that there's a cost difference. From a community standpoint, cost refers to how many limiteds are being used. Whether it's M0P1 or M1P0, both would be 2 cost. A limited agent and a limited Wenjin has no distinction over 2 limited agent drops and a P5 standard S rank. So while the system can be helpful to gauge at a glance level of investment in a team, an M1 Promeia with Weeping Gemini is going to be very different from an M1 Promeia with a P5 Fusion Compiler. A discussion on that kind of cost is beyond the scope of this video though. When I say cost difference, I mean it literally, as looking only in terms of limiteds can obfuscate the reality of the rates one has to contend with. At 180 pulls, you have roughly a 2 in 3 chance to get an agent and a Wenjin. The same 180 pulls, if put solely into agent banners, is going to average less than 1 in 2. You would need around 225 pulls to get similar probabilities on pulling an M1 as that of a base agent and a Wenjin. To contextualize it, that makes it 25% pricier. Naturally, a dupe doesn't have to be 25% better comparatively to justify it, but when thinking about what to go for, even if a Mindscape is more valuable than a signature, it's important to keep in mind that it's also more expensive than one. It's especially the case when the gain an M1 has over signature, even with high face standard alternatives, is demanding of strict routing and player adjustments for only marginal benefits. Lucia is on banner right now and she's a prime example of this. Unlike most supports who can fall back on Kaboom the Cannon, attack scaling really isn't all that good for Rupture agents. She can use a standard S-rank Wenjin, namely Weeping Cradle, but this isn't a perfect fit. It won't get full uptime in fights, it's barely up for a third of it. While you can technically calc for averages, its performance is better or worse depending on how you route the fight. If the buff is up for critical burst skills, it'll do better, but if it happens to drop midway through an ultimate, it'll do worse. The energy regen effect being only active when off-field also hurts, especially since swapping to her for EXs or even regular basics is needed to maximize Cradle's uptime. Then there's building around it too, as a lack of HP % on a main stat does make it a lot harder to max out Lucia's Darkbreaker. Even still, it can be built around, and Lucia's M1 is a standout for being an amazing Mindscape. The 18% rest shred it offers is somewhat standard for supportive M1s, but that's very good, being around a 15% increase in damage even against elemental weakness matches. This is of course even better against neutral enemies. Wandering Hunter is in rotation right now, and if you plan on running each one into it, Lucia's M1 is a big help. Arguably, it's even better if you're running Bindway. A 4-stun, 4-wrath, 4-ultimate route is difficult to pull off. Either it demands specific skill ordering combos that can lower total damage output, like by using ultimates for 4 toppling mountain, or tight anomaly management to make use of disorders for despo generation. It's here that Lucia's M1 is uniquely suited to help, as it comes with a passive 5% despo increase to the whole team, so Bindway no longer has to sweat for every last decibel. Heck, I have a whole video on how this 5% can open up brand new combos and routes. It's genuinely great. So finger in the air, her Mindscape can outperform her Wenjin, especially if you've got a high phase Grado and can weave in basics, CXs, and time her aftershocks to refresh its buff. But if someone were to ask me what I'd recommend pulling, 9 out of 10 times my response is going to be her Wenjin. Chances are, people aren't sitting on P5 Cradles and perfectly row discs to hit the sheer force buff cap. Even if they are, both Cradle and Dreamlit Hearth provide damage %, but Cradles is not only constantly falling off, the reset on its scaling bonus means it's rarely ever ramped up enough to match. Not to mention that Lucia's signature also gives combat HP, which translates directly to sheer force and rupture agents. All my platitudes about working around Cradle come off as armchair theory crafting, as in practice it's a lot harder to optimize it than what some few words would imply. There's a reason you see plenty of M1P0 Astra clears or even M0P0 user clears, and yet very few M1P0 Lucia clears. She's similar to Promeia in the sense that there are scenarios where her Mindscape does do better than her Wenjin, like with the P5 Cradle, but with far more obtuse routing demands and less consistency. Maybe you get Lucia ZX to go off at 17 on the clock, then get her Aftershock landing at 15 and have a ramped up buff for 2 back-to-back ultimates, putting her signature to shame. Or you're on Ishuan, do the whole chain trigger into Talisman and Despo ult combo, only to have Lucia come in after the entire burst is over, getting a whopping 0% damage buff throughout it all. It's one thing to say, press EX and hold basic to get the most out of Fusion Compiler on Promeia, where when at P5 the different averages to around 3% in score from her signature. It's another to say, sync up your EXs and Aftershock timings for specific moments, making sure to get the lattice hit to refresh buff application from the former to have max ramp up in time for ultimates, in order to get the most out of Cradle on Lucia, and average out to a little under 10% worse than signature. If the account is sitting on the P5 Cradle ready to go, and you've got the will to optimize its routes, it's M1. 15% team-wide damage on weakness and the Despo gain would make it better. If not, however, then shooting for the M0P1 baseline and keeping your account safe and sound from your 7th Necromata drop is a safer bet. There's cost maxing and there's value maxing, I suppose. While phase levels on standard Wenjins and just player skill and willingness to adapt can inform recommendations, so too can they change radically depending on the team and encounter. Sunna and Thoughtpop is an ideal example for this. Both her M1 and signature are really good. The former gives up to 21% depth shred, just under a 13% increase to total damage output on a standard enemy, while the latter has the highest energy regen out of all support Wenjins, on top of a fair bit of damage bonus and combat attack. If you're, say, playing Seed with her signature against Defiler, Sunna's M1 is easily a much better pick than her Wenjin. Stacking depth shred is synergistic. Corda's Germina alone increases Sunna's M1 value to around 15%, and if Cecille's on the team, then that goes up to almost 18%, making it even better than usual rest shred M1s. Not to mention that saturation greatly diminishes Thoughtpop's value. 10% combat attack at a base of 3000 is 300. When you factor in the 1000 attack from Onslaught, 1100 attack from Sunna and her Ether Veil, and endgame buffs like the 25% from Swift Strike, that results in barely a 5% increase. God forbid you're using Orphe and have 0 Dan active. Then for damage bonus, it sees even more saturation. 25% from Besiege, 30% from Additional, 25% from Corda's Germina, 18% from Moonlight Lullaby, 55% from Dawn's Bloom, 40% from Swift Strike, then a potential 24% from Astral Voice on a Vanguard, and 30% on AD5. That's 247% damage bonus. So a measly 25% on top translates to barely a 10% gain in total damage output. I am being a bit deliberate here. This damage bonus doesn't apply to all attacks, and a different D5 can be used, but it does illustrate how high numbers can get. Even then, at first this may seem like it makes them equal. Without factoring in Cecilia or Orphe, it's 15% from M1, versus a cumulative 15% from Thoughtpop. But that's only the case if Sunna wasn't using a Wenjin at all. The 12 to 16% combat attack from Kaboom the Cannon should be factored in, so it and M1 will pull out far ahead. With Yashin Guang though, and it isn't so clear. The extra energy regen Sunna's signature provides can at times allow for an additional enlightened mind state, making it far better than what its raw stats might imply. There are ways to route around it in fights though. On Primordial Nightmare for example, it's more than possible to get 11 enlightened mind states on a Dylan Sunna team, even with an A-rank Wenjin. Then you realize that Primordial Nightmare is a half-death boss. That makes Sunna's M1 be around 33% worse in value than against regular death enemies. It doesn't end there, as she faces similar circumstances when running with the idols. Sunna's ether veils are practically a necessity for the best aria combos, so her Wenjin's energy regen makes it much easier to route fights, being especially useful against certain bosses, like Sweeper. As with Yeshunguang, there are ways around it, but that isn't changing the fact that both the Squad and Solo and Sweeper are half-death enemies. 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7 all had show bosses that Sunna was a best in slot pick for, and all of them had half-death. If you're being particular about investment distribution, the safest pick for the Idols team would be to skip both Sunna's Mindscape and Signature, pulling for either Arias or Nangong's M1 and their Wenjins instead. But like with Evelyn's Signature, cross-compatibility with other agents is also a factor. Maybe the place to go for Thought Pop even in the cases where it turns out to be a little worse. On my Promeia Nangong Yuzuha runs, I had more success using it over Metanuki Morphosis. So if you skip Yuzuha's Signature, then Sunna's has more value than a Mindscape simply because of its broader use case. It's all situational. What are the teammates? What fights are you running in? And what's your investment status on other units in the account? This contextual view in itself can be problematic. If suddenly double death anomaly bosses start to pop up, Sunna's M1 rises in value, whereas if we keep getting half death, it lessens. Whatever it is you choose, the real ask is that what's best can keep changing. In fact, this may be most relevant of all for Promeia. We've already gone through how, if you have Fusion Compiler at high phases, Promeia's Mindscape is better. But is it? We know Valina is coming as a wind anomaly agent, and the mechanics of wind do a lot to elevate Frostfall Sickle. Nothing is set in stone, but going by the behavior on Scorch Horizon, when an anomaly is applied to an enemy under Windswept, said anomaly will trigger its own damage instance, like Shatter, a Vortex damage instance matching that element, and that's it. No disorder, no new anomaly to take over wind, it just stays on. In case you're not familiar with the bloom mechanics, it effectively inherits the stats of the currently active anomaly on the target. A Promeia without any drive discs or a Wenjin equipped will do more damage than a fully outfitted one within a bloom if it's being triggered off a stronger anomaly. Promeia's own stats don't matter. Pen ratio, attack percent, anomaly proficiency. All of these bonuses only translate over to her bloom damage if said bloom is being triggered off an ice anomaly inflicted by Promeia with these stats. Since wind effectively locks out a character from inflicting their anomaly to begin with, this means that Fusion Compiler does nothing to Promeia's bloom damage on windswept enemies. What does make a difference, however, is Frostfall Sickle's bloom damage bonus. Even if this bloom is being triggered off wind, or any other anomaly for that matter, the triggerer is Promeia, so such bonuses still apply. Likewise, the bloom damage gained from Promeia's core passive, which, if you recall, scales with the anomaly mastery that her signature can provide, would also apply. The reason Fusion Compiler is competitive with Frostfall Sickle is that, despite it lacking in the bloom damage bonus, its obscenely high stat value bumps up Promeia's ice anomaly to the point it makes up for that loss. On wind though, that benefit is gone. Of course, all of that would still apply to Shatter, and with wind having no disorders to work around, looping anomaly over and over for the most damage is the way. Fusion Compiler does well in that aspect, but Frostfall Sickle can be even better. Even if its Shatter damage falls behind that of a fully stacked P5 Fusion Compiler, those stacks will drop off, and Frostfall Sickle's anomaly mastery stat means it gets a lot more shatters. If her blooms are always triggering off wind, and Promeia is rewarded for applying anomalies on cooldown, the value of her signature skyrockets in comparison. Remember that her M1 is only giving a 13% increase for blooms with its F strat on compiler. When you factor in the anomaly mastery and the bloom damage bonus from Frostfall Sickle, even after accounting for saturation from teammate buffs, such as the additional attribute damage bonus from Yuzuha's additional ability and notes from the chain, Promeia would be getting a relative increase of almost 17% with her signature for blooms over M1 and compiler. This difference is absolute, as Wenjin stats can't make up for it. So it's looking like if you want her to work with Alina, pulling for her Wenjin is likely to be better than pulling for a Mindscape. If it hasn't landed yet, the message of this video is that the answer to which is better goes beyond simple numbers, and really does come down to, it depends. What are the phases on your standard S-rank Wenjins? How dedicated are you to grinding out routes? What teams do you intend to run the character in? Does the signature in question have use cases on other agents? And what enemies are you looking to maximize your score against? Even with all that, a future agent, boss, or mechanic can change it all. If, however, you want to ignore all semblance of nuance, pass by the point of this video, and just want to be told what to pull, let's do it. Ellen, Sig. Zhu Yan, M1. Even a P1 Brimstone is better. Qingyi, M1. Unless you use her in Rupture, then Sig. Jane, M2 to have basic human rights. Caesar, Sig and daily prayers for potential awakening. Bernice, Sig. Yanagi, Sig. Lyda, Sig. Miyabi, Sig. Harumasa, used to be Sig, but M1 with Brimstone is probably better now. Astra, M1. Evelyn, Sig. Sambi, Sig. Spectral Gaze, well, you need a trigger to use it, so Agent. Vivian, Sig is great for the Zorda comps, but M1 for fellow Bloomers. Hugo, M2, and Dial in to have basic human rights. Yishuan, Sig. Fufu, M1. Yuzuha, M1. Alice, Sig, then Flexer on Jane and Piper. Seed, Sig. Orphe, Sig. Lucia, Sig. Idhari, Sig. Dallin, Numbers say M1 but get Sig. Banyue, Sig. Yexinguang, Sig. Zhao, Sig. And a moment of silence for those who pulled M1 thinking it worked on anomalies. Sunna, weaving through this. Arya, Sig. Nangong, Sig. Cecilia, Sig, and M2 to give her independence. Promeia, watch this video. Silly, that's one I can't tell you about just yet. But if you are interested in learning how he plays, want to see him featured in some high-scoring Deadly Assault runs, or just want to learn about the game, be it niche tech or fundamental game mechanics, why not like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell? I've got more videos coming. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.